Guys, welcome to KamilSec. In this video, we will delve into the crucial process of conducting a gap analysis for the NIST 853 controls, that is transitioning from the revision 4 to revision 5. It is worth noting that many organizations, including the federal PMO, are in the midst of this transition. My goal here is to provide you with a valuable insight and tips for carrying out this gap analysis and updating your system security plan, that is the SSP. This video will actually be in two parts. This part, you are currently watching it on YouTube as evident. We'll be covering the initial steps and essential information. Part 2 of this video will be exclusive to my Patreon as a token of appreciation for their support. If you would like to access this in-depth content and additional resources not available on my YouTube channel, including the part 2 of this video, consider becoming a KamilSec Patron. You can find a link to my Patreon page in the video description below. But as always, a free way to support the channel is by hitting the subscribe button to help grow the channel if you haven't done so already. And thank you for that support. And don't forget to give that like button a gentle tap or an enthusiastic smash and ring that notification bell to stay updated whenever I release new videos. Thank you, and let's get started. All right, so now let's look at some of the key changes to the NIST 853 Revision 5 control. Revision 5 added a total of 66 new base controls. The base controls are the parent control, if you will, like the AC1, AC2, AC3, SC1, SC2, SC3. Those are the base control or the parent controls. Now, Revision 5 added 202 new control enhancements. Right, so the control enhancement will be the ones in the parentheses, like AC2, parentheses 1, parentheses 2. Those are what we call the control enhancement. And this documentation or this new revision added 202 of those new control enhancement. Now, moving on, Revision 5 added about 131 new control parameters to the existing controls. Now, what is a control parameter? A control parameter refers to specific settings or value associated with the security controls. For example, if you have the IA5 that talks about password settings, right? So these, the length of the password, the history, the complexity of the password, these are what we call the parameters of the controls, right? It's subjective to the organization or the agency. Some agencies might decide to do 12 characters, others will do 16 characters, 10 characters, whatever they decide to do. These are all the control parameters that they implement to, or they incorporate into the control implementation. So Rev5 added 131 of these new parameters to the existing controls. All right, moving on. Revision 5 has 90 newly withdrawn controls that are incorporated into or moved into other controls. 90 of these controls are being incorporated into other controls. They are not completely withdrawn, but they have been incorporated into some of the other existing controls. Now, and finally, Revision 5 has a total of 1,007 base control and enhancement. So in a nutshell, all the controls that we are dealing with in the Revision 5 of the NIST 853 documentation is 1,007 controls in total. All right, so now to carry out a gap analysis of Revision 4 to Revision 5 of the NIST 853 controls, here are some of the proposed steps that I recommend. First of all, you have to obtain the NIST 853 Revision 5 documentation. That is, obtain a copy of that document and become familiar with its structure and content. This will serve as a reference during the gap analysis. That is, when you look at the NIST Special Publication 853 Revision 5 documentation, notice that, the baseline control as we used to see it in Rev4 is a different documentation now in Rev5. You're going to see 853B, and the B stands for the baseline documentation, right? So just familiarize yourself with this documentation and see how the structure of this documentation is. especially at the table of content, right? So now you see that these are the two new additions to the families. We have the PII processing and transparency, and then the supply chain risk management. Get yourself, in tune with this documentation and see how the document has been structured and, developed. That's what the first step is saying. Make sure you understand how the document is structured, and also take note of the fact that if you want to see the baseline, it's not going to be in this document. It's actually going to be in this documentation here that says control baseline for information system and organization, which is what? The 853B. And again, the B stands for what? The baseline, right? And likewise, in this documentation, the table of content for the 853B is what you have to pay attention to, right? And see exactly how this document has been developed, right? For instance, we have the control baseline, selecting control baseline, the control baseline assumptions, the tailoring control baselines, and the capabilities, and all the 20 control families here. You can see all the baselines, right? So in a nutshell, the very first step of this process is saying, familiarize yourself with these two documentation and how these documentations are structured. Now, moving on. Now, you have to identify your existing controls. Now, how do you do that? You have to list all the security controls and practices currently in place that is in the SSP within your organization based on the NIST 853 Revision 4. The current way you guys have implemented these controls is going to be in the SSP, right? The documentation at least is going to be in the SSP. See how the controls were implemented. Read the implementation statement of these controls in Rev4, right? Get yourself familiarized with those implementation statements within the Rev4 of your organization. That is pretty much how you guys implemented the Rev4 controls, right? Once you do that, now, the next step here will be to compare the Rev4 and the Rev5. And how do we do that? We list all the controls for Rev5 for your system baseline and carefully compare the controls and the requirement in Rev4 with those in Rev5 to identify changes, additions, and removals. So to do that, I came up with this spreadsheet that's going to help you kind of organize your work. And a lot of times this thing might be assigned to more than one person. Could be 2 or 3, depending on how many members you have in your team. For you guys to actually work on this gap analysis, you might be assigned some few controls. Sometimes somebody will be assigned all the technical controls, or maybe the first 3 controls, 4 families of controls, and then so on and so forth, right? You guys will be assigned, different controls. But this spreadsheet that I came up with will actually help you in doing the comparison and see what has changed and how you actually going to keep track of those changes. So for instance, right, I have this one in Rev4. So the Rev4 control, for example, the AC1, that's the control name. That is the control number. And then we have the control title, and then we have the control requirement, and then the control implementation statement. So notice that the control number for Rev4 is AC-1, and this has not changed in Rev5, right? Control title, access control, policy, and procedure. But notice how this has been changed to policy and procedure without the access control in Rev5. So these are some of the little details that you have to pay attention to when you are doing your gap analysis to make sure you accurately capture what the Rev5 documentation is calling for. Now, when you go to the control requirement, this is the control requirement in Rev4. Right? See how the control parameters are just few, right? But notice the control requirement in Rev5. A lot of the control parameters, some of the control parameters or some control parameters have been added here. So for instance, when you take a look at this, it says develop, document, and disseminate to assignment, organization, defined personnel or role. 1. Selection, 1 or more organizational level, mission, business process level, system level, access control policy that addresses, right? This parameter here was not in the Rev4. So you see they added a level of that. meaning you can select this access control policy and procedure to be at the organizational level or mission business level or the system level. That is another parameter they added before they jump into what? The policy that addresses purpose, scope, role, responsibility, management commitment, coordination among organizational entity, and so on and so forth. This is the same as this one here, right? And then notice how they also added another parameter, the B, the policy that is consistent with applicable laws, executive orders, directive, regulation, policy, standard, and guidelines, right? This parameter was not in the Rev4 control requirement. This is a new addition to the Rev5 documentation. Now, when you go down here, it talks about you have to designate an assignment organization defined official to manage the development, documentation, and the dissemination of the access control policy and procedure. This parameter here was not in Rev4. They did not ask for anybody to be designated, somebody who's going to be solely responsible for these development, documentation, and dissemination of this document. That was not in Rev4. So that was another parameter that was added in Rev5 that you have to take note of. And then you notice that all the rest will be what? Review and update the current access control policy, and then assignment define the frequency, and assignment organizational define level of event. This assignment was not in the Rev4 because it only says the frequency. You have to update your policy or your procedure based on whatever frequency. You have 3 years for policy and 1 year for procedure. But when you look at the parameter in the Rev5, it actually added one level by saying that you have to assign, that is assignment, organization defined event. It is not just the frequency of 3 years and 1 year, but also if there is any major changes in your documentation, in your system, in your organization, if you choose to do it at the organizational level, right, or the mission business process level, then if there is any changes in the restructuring of the organization, meaning even if your 1 year or 3 years is not up to, it's not up yet, it's not due yet, I should say, then you have to update that document because the event is either or. It's either you meet the organizational defined frequency, or if there is any change in the organizational structure, system, mission, business process level. So you see how they kind of, added a whole lot of parameters to just this control. And you're going to see that in all of the controls. There are some controls that have been left as is without any major changes or major modification. That's fine. But this document here will help you kind of put them in side by side and see what are the new parameters of the control that have been changed. And you notice how I kind of mimic this new control requirement to do a sample implementation statement. Now, let's look at the implementation statement. So this section titled Access Control, policy of the IMOTech solution, access control policy document at organizational level, and it defined the access control for IMOTech solution information system within the organization. The policy addresses purpose, scope, all the way to compliance, right? And then B, the B here is talking about is consistent with applicable federal laws. So IMOTech solution developed its access control policy that is consistent with applicable federal laws or applicable laws, executive orders, directive, regulation, all the way to mandates, right? And then we look at the A, procedure to facilitate the implementation of the access control policy and associated access control. And how did I write that? IMOTech solution developed its access control procedure to facilitate the implementation of access control policy. Now, the B part is saying designate an assignment organization defined official. So how do we write that? IMOTech solution has designated the ISO and the system owner to manage the development, documentation, and dissemination of the access control policy and procedure. This could be subjective. Your organization, whoever is going to be designated person doing this, is the one that you're going to state in this implementation statement. And now the C, review, update the current access control policy, assignment, organization defined frequency, right? And following assignment, organization defined event. So how did I write that? In IMOTech solution, review and update the current access control policy every 3 years, or when there is a major update to the system or the organization. You can add to the system or the organization. Right? And then also the C part is the same thing with the procedure, right? IMOTech solution review and update the current access control procedure annually, that is 1 year, or when there is a major update to the system. And likewise, we can say all the organization, if there's any restructuring within the organization. However way you're going to write it to make sense for whoever is reading this implementation statement. So these are some of the things that, this spreadsheet that I came up with to compare these controls side by side will help you achieve, right? To also understand, or to help you understand these changes better, there is this document from FedRAMP. This document is not my document. This is a document that FedRAMP created to help organizations understand the basic changes, or the changes that have been, incorporated or taken place from Rev4 to Rev5. This document is actually a FedRAMP document. You can go to FedRAMP Marketplace and search for this document if you like. But this is the document that will give you an overview of what has changed. And then also to understand this document, the legend actually, help you here, because for instance, this salmon pig shade says used to identify controls and enhancement new to Rev5. This new control and control enhancement are also indicated in the change element column as new control. And then what is the dark gray shading? Used to identify controls and enhancement that were withdrawn in Rev5, right? So this one here to talk about the light gray shading, used to identify control enhancement that were withdrawn in previous version. And then add parameters. A new parameter has been added. Typically, the new parameter is quoted or characterized in detail column, right? And then change title, a control whose title has been modified. These are the legend that will help you understand the controls or what has been changed. New base control, a base control that did not exist in Rev4. Mostly you're going to see that in the word, the PII processing and transparency and the supply chain risk management control. Those are the new families, right? The new family, of course, they're going to have a lot of the base controls. So these, this legend will help you understand. So when you go back to this main document here, for instance, access control that we just looked at in my own spreadsheet that I created for the gap analysis, you notice that it tells you exactly what has changed. Like change elements here, what has changed is the title. We notice that the access control was taken out in Rev5, and then the name was just left as what, policy and procedure. So meaning the title changes here. You can see exactly what changed. And then change control text. You notice that in the text of the control itself, there were a lot of changes, right? The way they write the control requirement, as we saw in that spreadsheet that I came up with, you notice that a lot of text were changed. Add control text, exactly. So the changes, and then they added a lot of text to the control. They added a lot of parameters, as we saw, like, designating someone who is responsible for updating, documentation, and dissemination of this control, which was not in Rev4. So that is one of the changes here too. And then changes discussion, right? So they look at the discussion, in terms of supplemental guidance, right? There's a lot of changes in the discussion part, which was called supplemental guidance in Rev4, but now in Rev5 it's called discussion. There are a lot of changes in those discussion as well. You can take a look at the videos that I'm doing in the control series. You notice how the discussions have been changed in a lot of these controls from 4 to 5. And then add privacy control baseline, right? So add to privacy control baseline. So AC-1 has been added to the privacy control. It's part of the privacy control now, right? So this document will help you understand what you are dealing with. If you're dealing with control, let's say AC1, right there, this column H, will give you the highlight of changes that has occurred. If you're dealing with AC2, you know that remove parameters. There are a lot of parameters that were removed, and then there are a lot that were added in the parameters. And the discussion, there's a lot of changes in the discussion as well. So the column H is your go-to to understand what has been changed in this document. This document, again, is from Federal. For you to understand how these controls were modified, you can find this document, on the Federal Marketplace. But I can also download this and put it on my Patreon page. For anybody who wants to download it, they can have access to it in my Patreon page as well. Moving on. So now let's look at the next proposed steps here, right? You have to highlight the differences. What are some of the differences that we saw? You create a document or a spreadsheet, just like I showed you, my spreadsheet that I created, to highlight the specific difference between the Rev4 and the Rev5 for each of the control. Note if a control has been modified, added, or removed. So if there is any control that has been modified, added, or removed, you have to take note of that. So for example, when you look at the AC2 enhancement 10, right? So this control has been withdrawn, right? This control has been withdrawn from Rev5, but it has been incorporated into AC2K. As you can see in the revision 4 documentation, right? This control was AC2 enhancement 10. It says account management, shared, group account credential termination. The information system terminates shared or group account credential when members leave the group. This was the control in revision 4. That is AC2 enhancement 10. This was how it was written in revision 4. Now, let's take a look at revision 5 and see what happened. AC2 enhancement 10. See, this is AC2. Let's make sure that we are looking at AC2. So this is AC2 and the enhancement 10. The enhancement 10 has been withdrawn. It says account management, shared or group account credential change. Withdrawn, incorporated into what? AC2K. Now, let's look at AC2K and see if this control kind of makes sense. You see, it says, so now let's look at AC2K. It says, establish and implement a process for changing shared or group account authenticators, if deployed, when individuals are removed from the group. So this has been incorporated into the K instead of having a special or a different enhancement for it. All right, so these are some of the things that you take notes when you are doing your gap analysis. What controls have been withdrawn or what controls have been withdrawn and incorporated into what controls. These are some of the things that you have to take. So in essence, that is saying that if you had a control implementation statement for AC enhancement 10 already in your SSP for revision 4, meaning you have to delete that implementation statement when you are transitioning into revision 5, because revision 5 does not have AC2 enhancement 10. That has been withdrawn and incorporated into the K. So that control enhancement, if you address that control implementation statement in 2K, you don't need to address that in enhancement 2, in AC2 enhancement 10. So take note of that. Whatever is being incorporated into whatever control, that implementation statement, make sure it reflects in where or which other control that control has been implemented or incorporated with. All right, so this is the end of the part 1 of this video, right? So if you want to get access to the part 2 will not be on YouTube, but it will be uploaded on my Patreon page, as a token of appreciation for those patrons. So if you want to get access to the part 2 of this video, you can sign up to my Patreon page and you have access to that, as well as the spreadsheet that I came up with for your gap analysis. And I also upload the FedRAM spreadsheet as well for easy access. But you can as well go to FedRAM page and download this document. But again, I will upload it on my Patreon page for easy access once you become a Patreon member for KamilSec. Our next YouTube video will be continuation of our control explanatory series. Based on the votes, the next control we will be looking at will be the configuration management. Please do like, Subscribe, share, and comment so the YouTube algorithm will expose this video to a broader audience, ensuring that more people can benefit from my videos. Thank you for being part of this community. See you in our next video.